Pollinators are an essential part of an ecosystem, and having enough bees and other pollinating insects around at just the right time can be a critical part of the success of growing a crop. It is great to have a hive of honeybees right beside the gardens that I'm managing, and there are also lots of other pollinators in the surrounding landscape, including at least 4 species of native bumblebees. Over the past few years, we've noticed a definite increase in the number of these bumblebees, as they seem to be thriving in the rough, overgrown grassland and the diversity of landscape within the general area. But this season there seems to be significantly fewer of these very useful insects around, and perhaps fewer insects in general. I'm not aware of anything changing in the surrounding landscape that would have led to this decline in insect population this year. If anything, the habitat has continued to improve for supporting biodiversity. The past winter season wasn't too cold, and the weather that for so far this season has been mixed, but within the range that we would typically expect in this area. But we did get 2 nights of unusually hard frost quite late in the season, and this might be the possible reason why the population of these bumblebees has been lower this year. There are still very active bumblebees around, just not so many of them, but I have had unexpected issues with pollination in the gardens this year, and I suspect that it's not just because there are fewer of these essential insects around. To start with, I need to put all of this in context, as I've found that very few vegetable plants in the gardens need to be pollinated. The diversity of root vegetables, the onions and garlic, the different types of lettuces and other salad greens, and all the brassicas that I grow are harvested before the plants even start to flower. So honeybees and bumblebees are not needed to produce the vegetables in the gardens themselves, but in many cases the pollinators are needed to produce the seeds, so there is still an essential part of the process somewhere else, but not in my gardens as I currently don't save seeds for most vegetables. Potatoes don't need pollinators, despite having flowers, as they produce tubers even if the flowers are removed, and we grow them by planting a potato, not by planting a true seed. Even some of the fruiting crops, such as tomatoes, apparently don't need pollination, as they were bred or evolved to not need the help of bees for the pollen to be transferred within the flower, though in some cases it might help. Runner beans do seem to benefit from pollination help, but the pollination of peas apparently occurs before the flowers even open. The main types of plants that I grow that obviously need pollinators are courgettes or zucchini, squash, and pumpkins, and their very large flowers are attractive to bees, but it is also possible to pollinate them by hand if I need to. So a lack of pollinators this year doesn't seem to really have an impact on the productivity of the gardens, apart from the crop of broad beans or fava beans, which I was surprised about. This season I've had a very poor crop from the spring-sown broad beans that I usually grow in 4 different outside gardens that I manage, from the same variety that I've had good success with in the past. Only a few pods formed at the base of some of the plants from some of the first flowers that appeared, but then nothing developed from all the flowers that blossomed for weeks after that. In 3 of the gardens, it seems that more than 80% of the plants didn't produce any pods of beans during this extended period, despite having a huge numbers of flowers. In the 4th garden, a few pods did develop at the base of each plant, but these seeds were sown a few weeks earlier and so also started to flower a few weeks earlier. I don't think this lack of pods developing has been weather-related, as these plants are quite hardy, and we've had a reasonable amount of warmth and soil moisture during this time. And most of the plants are quite strong and have grown quite tall, and although there is now a little bit of rust developing on some of the lower leaves, and a few small clusters of blackfly, the plants seem healthier than I've noticed in the past. So the health of the plants doesn't seem to explain the tiny fraction of pods that I would normally expect. And it seems to me that this has been more of a problem with pollination, or more accurately because of a lack of pollinators. I had thought that the flowers of broadbean plants were capable of self-pollination, as each flower apparently contains all of the essential parts, though I remember reading that there can be some benefit from bees tripping or shaking the flowers. But perhaps the bees are much more important than I thought for this crop. I suspect that the large patch of comfrey near the gardens is responsible for this pollination failure of the broadbeans. The flowers of the comfrey plant are highly attractive to bees, especially bumblebees, and there is often quite a buzz from all the bees and other insects gathering nectar from this patch. Some people grow comfrey specifically to support and encourage bees and other pollinators, but I've grown this clump of plants mainly as a source of fertility. In past years, I would usually have fully cut back the comfrey just as the flowering started, and use the leaves and stems as a valuable source of biomass and fertility for the compost, or as a mulch directly in the gardens. This year, I left all the plants to flower, partially because I wanted to help support the lower population of bumblebees, and I think that was my mistake. While I had noticed bumblebees at the broadbean flowers earlier in the season, they seemed to stop visiting the crop at about the same time as the comfrey flowers started to appear. I can't be sure about the timing, but once I began to notice the issue, whenever I checked there was definitely lots of bumblebees in the comfrey flowers, but none in the broadbean flowers. When the comfrey stopped flowering, I noticed a few more pods developing from the last of the flowers at the top of these quite tall plants again, but not many. I had sowed another batch of the same variety of broadbeans in some spare ground 4 weeks after the main crops in the gardens, and they are still flowering strongly, and there are a few bumblebees around and the number of pods developing, but not many. The bumblebees are now more attracted to the squash and courgette flowers and to some of the crops in the polytunnels, and there have also been lots of honeybees and bumblebees at the clover flowers in the grass surrounding the gardens. It seems that pollinators will focus on their preferred flower or plant rather than visiting all the flowers in the landscape. And I guess this makes sense, as they will go for the plants that provide them with the most nectar or pollen, or at least the ones that are most attractive and easier for them. And it seems that the broadbean flowers may be too much of a hassle. Apparently, in order to enter the flower, the bees need to force their way in between the petals, and this is what may help trigger the pollination of the flower. This takes a fair amount of effort, perhaps too much for the smaller honeybees, and it seems that even the larger and stronger bumblebees have found a way to get around this effort by drilling into the base of the flower from the outside in order to get at the nectar. It is an amazing thing to watch and quite clever of them, but it doesn't help with the pollination. And once there was something better on offer, such as the comfrey flowers, the bumblebees seemed to become distracted, and I hardly have any broadbeans to harvest as a result. Perhaps if there was a lot more bumblebees around, there would be a greater chance of the broadbeans being pollinated, but it is unfortunate that the flowers of this crop that I want to grow seem to be the ones that are among the first to be abandoned by the pollinators. I think this might explain an issue that I've noticed in the past, where there are fewer pods on the plants compared to the numbers of flowers. While each flower on a pea plant seems to develop into a pod, this is not what I've noticed with broadbeans. There are often 4 to 6 individual flowers per cluster at each node where the leaf grows from the stem, but in the past I've found that rarely more than 2 of these flowers produce pods. I had thought that these plants were self-limiting in some way, or there was some other issue for why there were flowers not producing pods, but perhaps insufficient pollination has been the issue all along. Interestingly, one of the best crops of broadbeans I've ever grown was from autumn-sown seeds in the polytunnel garden last year. The better growing conditions of this microclimate would definitely have helped, and a different variety may have also helped to improve the yield. But now that I think about it, the flowers on these plants would have been out much earlier in the season. Perhaps these flowers were the best option for the bumblebees that were foraging at that time, as there might not have been many other types of flowers for them to choose from so early in the season. So this season I've given up on the main crop of broadbeans from 3 of the gardens, with only very few pods to harvest, and have decided to remove and compost all the plants so that I can get another crop into the ground. But I'll leave the crop in one garden to see how the few recently pollinated pods develop. Next year I'm definitely going to cut back all of the comfrey plants and to not let them flower, and hopefully whatever knocked back the population of bumblebees this year won't be repeated next season. And I hope that leaving the comfrey to flower this season will at least help to establish healthier population of pollinators in the future, at the expense of missing out on a broadbean crop this year. I could try planting a greater diversity of pollinator-attracting plants directly in the gardens beside all the vegetable plants, to further support and attract pollinators and hope that they will also visit the broadbean plants in the process. But if all of these plants had flowers that are more attractive than the broadbean flowers, then I could end up with another poor crop. Or perhaps there is something else going on that I just don't understand. Another option would be to try to hand-pollinate some of the flowers, or at least try to assist in the tripping of the flowers by gently pulling at the petals, or tapping them to shake them the way that a bumblebee might. This would be an additional task at a busy time of year, but if it worked and I was able to get a lot more pods, it could be worth the effort. Even if I only tried hand-pollinating a number of the flower clusters, or sections of the row, and marked them, then I would at least be able to test the theory that pollination is an issue. And of course, I plan to be much more observant about what is happening with this crop next season, to keep an eye on when bumblebees and other pollinating insects may be visiting the flowers of these broadbean plants, or when they might be distracted by other flowers in the surrounding landscape.